Okay, guys, I want to get a little bit into some of the neuroscientific research. This is a little bit more complicated. And again, for those of you who have more of a background in biology and neurology, some of this may already be known to you. You have more of a foundation for it. For those of you who do not have as much coursework, sorry, something caught my eye over there. For those of us who don't have as much coursework in biology and neurobiology, I will do my best to give you as much of an explanation as I can to lay the foundation, and hopefully we'll all be on the same page in the end, because it is important to understand these things, to understand the biological side of the biopsychosocial spiritual work when it comes to this concept of food addiction. So let's get into it. What is the neuroscientific research? Well, studies indicate that exposure to those so-called comfort foods, right? Those high fat, high sugar foods, the cookies, the ice cream, the cake, the burgers, the pizza. Those foods in particular stimulate the dopaminergic pathways in the brain. In particular, that nucleus accumbens. And remember when I talked in my prior lecture about substance addiction and alcohol addiction, that nucleus accumbens was particularly important structure in the dopaminergic pleasure pathway, so-called, in the brain, that is impacted and hijacked. Hijacked? Well, that's a new word. Impacted and hijacked by excessive alcohol and or substance abuse. Studies indicate these high comfort foods with lots of fat and sugar do something similar in those same structures in the brain. Neuroimaging studies, and remember what this means, we can use fMRIs and look at blood flow in particular areas of the brain. We can use PET scans and measure metabolic activity in particular areas of the brain. We can do MRIs to get very high resolution pictures of the brain. These neuroimaging studies indicate brain response is similar in the presence of food and drug abuse. We are seeing increased cell activation, so increased metabolism, increased blood flow in that nucleus accumbens. So the same structure in the brain that is hijacked, that is influenced, that is triggered by things like cocaine and heroin and alcohol is also triggered by high fat, high sugar foods. Neuroimaging studies in humans have also indicated similarities between obesity and addiction. So, for example, people who are clinically obese and people who are suffering from substance and or alcohol addiction have what we call fewer D2 receptors in the brain. And this, I'm going to explain this in more detail in a moment, but the fewer D2 dopamine 2 receptors in the brain are an indication that people who are both obese and or suffer from an addictive process, a traditional addictive process, are less sensitive over time to reward stimuli. So they are more vulnerable to continue to increase their intake to try to get the same level of heightened stimulation in the reward pathway of the brain, whether that means more high-fat, high-sugar food intake, or whether that means more cocaine or alcohol or nicotine intake. Individuals who have the largest BMI, which is a typical measure of obesity in the medical literature, body mass index. People who have the largest BMI also had the lowest D2 receptor values. So we know that a reduction in D2 receptors has been associated with reduced inhibition over controlling one's intake of drugs. And the argument in the research on food addiction is the same holds for food. And so the idea is some people may be vulnerable biologically because they have fewer D2 receptors in the brain. That makes the requirement to get reward stimulating in the pathway of the brain related to pleasure. The requirement when you have fewer D2 receptors is you need more intake of food, more intake of drugs to stimulate those pathways. People who have more D2 receptors need less intake to get the same impact. So let's talk a little bit about these receptors for those of you who are not as accustomed to the biological aspect of this. D2 receptors are dopamine receptors, and I talked a lot about the importance of dopamine in the prior lecture with regard to reward pleasure, and even the idea of something being important and something being remembered as critical for survival, right? When we activate the dopaminergic pathways in the brain, we actually have five types of dopamine receptors in the brain: D1, D2, D3, D4, D5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. There's actually some speculation in the newer research that we have a sixth and a seventh type of dopamine receptor, but this is not conclusive, so there's not full agreement on that, but there is agreement on the 5. Different proteins are involved in these different receptors for dopamine in the brain. D1 and D2 in particular, research indicates are very important for understanding addictive processes, drug addiction and reward pathways in the brain, and what happens as a result of excessive use of alcohol and drugs. The research on food addiction is also beginning to indicate that D1 and particularly D2 is associated with both obesity and out of control eating processes, particularly for high fat and high sugar food intake. Okay, I will catch you on the next slide.